I want to talk about a whole other challenge to secularisation theory, the most interesting challenge in a way, because it just asks a different question. It just comes at the whole issue a different way. And this one says, rather than always thinking about everything as growth or decline, what about change? What about transformation? Some things just change. I mean, for example, if you said, oh, people don't send telegrams anymore, so instant messaging has fallen out of favour. Well, no, it's just that we've got different forms of instant messaging now. So maybe if we're just thinking about secularisation and just looking at churches and saying they're declining, well, yep, maybe they are in some parts of the world, but is something else taking its place? So this whole bundle of challenges to secularisation theory say, let's start thinking about maybe religion is just changing its shape rather than it's declining. I want to go back to a point I began with right at the beginning, and that was to think quite hard about what kind of privilege the people who are developing these theories about religion are coming from. And I mentioned that the classical theories, and indeed the modern theories, were all by white Western men. And that's bound to give them a certain bias. We saw that they had a sort of implicit, or at least a possibly colonial, but certainly a Eurocentric and then Western-centric view of the world. Possibly colonial because there's a racial element in there as well. They've also got a gender bias. And once you started to get women to coming into the study of religion, they started to notice sorts of religion and spirituality that the other scholars hadn't taken seriously before. Spirituality is a word that's often used for a lot of these sorts of below the radar, not taken seriously until women started noticing them, because women are more involved in them. What is spirituality? Most people who use that word, and it's used a lot in real life, are using it to say that it's about more personal, individual, non-institutional, interior practices, as opposed to institutional religion, which has got a lot of externals to it. So usually the words spirituality and religion go together. They make sense in opposition to one another. So it's undeniable that in Britain today, words like chi, as in Tai Chi, or spirit and spirituality, and Feng Shui, and yoga and Reiki, and these things are just as familiar as old Christian language about the Trinity and the Atonement and the resurrection and things like that. So it has had a big influence in the culture, and lots of people access alternative, complementary spirituality. So what is spirituality, and where's it growing, and what other kinds of religion? If you take a bigger lens to religion and you include more through the filter, what other things do we think might be relevant to secularisation theory? Well, I mentioned earlier as well that Thomas Luckman didn't just write about secularisation, he wrote a really important book called The Invisible Religion. And that's because he noticed something, which was that people weren't necessarily going to church, they weren't believing the Christian stuff anymore, but they were still interested in deep questions about meaning and about spiritual forces, beings, entities. And he thought that what we were seeing in Europe was the individualisation of religion. So rather than taking a kind of package deal, you develop your own spirituality. Obviously, you take elements that exist already, but you become the ultimate arbiter. Now you might say, well, why wouldn't this happen in religion? Because it's happened everywhere else. We no longer just vote for one political party because our parents did it. We like to be independent and make up our own minds. It would make a lot of sense that people have become more individualised in democratic, consumerist, highly educated societies, where there aren't big stigmas about changing your religion or having your own religious or spiritual views. So that's the individualisation of religion. And Luckman says it's invisible, because, I mean, churches are really obvious. They're out there and they've got a big spire. But if it's just something you're doing in your own heart and in your own home, it's invisible. And so people discount it. It's hard to measure, it's hard to see, but it's still real. That's the individualisation approach. There's a slightly different approach, which we can call the subjectivisation approach. I like to take a bit of credit for this view because I did a big study in Kendal in Cumbria in the beginning of the 21st century. And I did that study with my colleagues, looking at every kind of religion and spirituality. And we were really surprised to find 126 different sorts of spiritual group or one-to-one practice. Things like paganism, Reiki, various faith healings. I could go on and on. And we tried to think why this was. And it looked like it had been really growing since the 70s. And we noticed that 80% of the people involved were women. It was women setting up the groups, it was women running the groups or offering the therapies. And we thought that what was happening was that these were people who had been mostly brought up in a traditional kind of religion, mostly the churches, and decided that it wasn't for them for various reasons, but still had a very strong spiritual life, a sense of connection with spiritual beings or spiritual life force, and they developed it in their own ways. So we argued they're doing this because they're wanting to get in touch with their subjective life. They're wanting to say, I didn't want to take religion on trust. I didn't want to do it just because there was an authority telling me to. It didn't feel right to me. But when I found Reiki, it just felt right. So in that sense, we talked about the turn to subjective life. People making their subjective life the authority in relation to religion, not an external authority like a scripture or a prophet or a teacher. And we call that not individualisation but subjectivisation, because emotions and feelings and going deeper into yourself are so important. So I've talked about individualisation and subjectivisation. Some people, like Steve Bruce, have critiqued all this work and said there is spirituality around, but it's very trivial and it can't last because it doesn't form strong groups like churches. So it's doomed to just fade because you're not passing on to anybody and you're not reinforcing it. So he thought it's going to just accelerate secularisation. So a third sort of challenge has come from some really recent studies. And there's one book I particularly want to mention by Claire Wanless. And she takes a community, a town in, I think it's Yorkshire, and she finds that although people have an individualised or subjectivised form of spirituality or religion, they're not just doing it on their own. That's the point of her book. There are forms of community. She's arguing against Steve Bruce. There are online communities, really important for people these days, and there are networks. If I'm a particular sort of Wiccan, I will look for and find people online, and then we might well start a chat room, we might start emailing, we might well meet for festivals, and it might be across the globe. I mean, these are just examples, she's got others, but the point is there's much more community. Just stop looking for something like a church or a mosque. Yes, there's no dedicated building or Sunday worship, but there are people meeting together and thereby, against Bruce, reinforcing their belief and quite possibly passing it on to other people. So she thinks it's stronger, that kind of spirituality, than has been assumed, and it may well continue, even grow. So I've talked about individualised, subjectivised, and then these new forms of religious community or spiritual community, all challenging the secularisation decline theory. We've also I've talked before about how we're seeing the politicisation of religion and religion in the public sphere, and the whole Trump Christian phenomenon, or Brexit and how important religion was. and many other parts of the world where you're seeing religion being politicised and politics being religified. That's another phenomenon that challenges secularisation theory. I've also talked about the big challenge of taking a global, decolonial, decolonised perspective on religion and looking at the globe as a whole and the whole sheer complexity of growth, decline and everything else and change. And I talked about what's growing. Pentecostal Christianity, well, that's a new sort of Christianity. It developed from the 20th century. Resurgent forms of Islam, they're new forms of Islam. Fundamentalism is itself a religion that was a kind of religion invented in the 20th century. So religion does have this ability to keep changing, reinventing itself, adapting to capitalism, adapting to globalisation. And my final point, adapting to a digital age. We've only started to scratch the surface of what difference it makes to have religion online. But we're starting to see it might not help the old sorts of religion, or perhaps it will, but it does help develop, recruit people, learn about religion, maybe just lurk and find out more, and quite often just have it, coming at you even when you weren't expecting it. Take TikTok, that is currently popular with a really young generation. There are things like the TikTok witches. You get Wicca, this neo-pagan teaching coming at you. Your TikTok's quite a good platform to teach someone about a religion they might not have heard of, and what it involves, and what practice it involves, and how people dress. Or take an extremist example, ISIS, the political Islamic movement. That was only able to exist because of the internet. It recruited people online. That's how it did its work. And it did very slick propaganda videos online. So, yes, it recruited people to go to Syria and real places and really fight, but it only worked with the internet. And finally, I mentioned you have apps now. You have apps for example, astrology, which is, it's not a religion, but it's not secular either. It thinks that planetary forces really influence our lives. Well, there are apps like CoStar that have millions of downloads. So in all these really interesting ways, religion and spirituality, as they always have, just keep changing. So the story of one-way decline from we were in the past really religious, now we're really secular, I think that has really been blown out of the water. And we're more open today to looking at, well, this kind of religion's declined, and it's declined here, but this has changed, this has grown, it's completely different in this part of Africa, and really just being much more diverse in the way that we approach religion worldwide.